Hi again. Let's talk about graphic narratives. In this lecture, we're going to examine the changes that took place in American comic books after World War II. World War II was enormously influential on American comic books. Not only were they sent out to virtually every soldier on battlefields all over the globe, but they also were impacted by the fact that many of the artists of comic books were called up to serve in the war themselves. So it was a very real and palpable experience for many people, both the artists and the readers of American comics. Bill Mauldin was one such of these artists who got a job in the military as a cartoonist and was actually trained as a soldier and sent into the battlefield, not to fight, but to actually make comics and send them back for publication in Stars and Stripes magazine. At first, his comics were lighthearted, jokey affairs dealing with the drudgery and craziness of boot camp. But once he got to the battlefield, the realities of war began to appear in his comics. Bearded soldiers, mired in mud and fatigue, with the simple, gritty reality of daily life on battlefields all over Italy where he was stationed. You can see it in the way that he really took up the perspective of the everyday soldier. Here, camp hands complain that a 3-star general has arrived as just another mouth to feed. But there was humor even in the darkest reality. The sense that soldiers had a certain fatality about them was, of course, grounds for insubordination among some of the superiors. General Patton hated Bill Mauldin and wanted him fired from the magazine. It was actually only as General Eisenhower stepped in to counter that argument that saved the publication. Bill Mauldin went on to become a very successful political cartoonist, and he was hailed as a hero wherever he went. Soldiers deeply admired the way that he captured their reality. But he struggled with depression and what we now call PTSD from the experience of having so many friends and comrades die in combat. War comics were a very popular mainstay at this time, and many of them took up Bill Mauldin's goal of creating heroic and gritty truths from the battlefield. Out of all the printed matter mailed to soldiers in 1942, 30% were comic books purchased by the U.S. military and sent to soldiers all over the world. And this had a profound impact, not only on the reading of soldiers, passing the time, but also they were traded and used as barter across the globe, introducing many cultures for the first time to American comics, which have a huge impact on their reception elsewhere. Back home, another new genre emerges during the war, and that was teen comics, hoping for escape from the drudgery of the news. The antics of teens had become a popular fascination, and this had gone into the comic book world with a force. Bob Montana was the first to come up with this new character Archie, and his friends, Betty, Veronica, Jughead, have all now become well-known characters. They've survived all the changes since then. The style was established pretty early on. This cartoony characters in a fairly realistic world, but there was a strong sense of emotion and sexuality. These young, nubile teens flirted and battled across the pages. These had been spun out into numerous movies, TV shows, you name it. Back home, there was also a taste for older, more mature themes. True crime began in 1942 with Charles Burroughs' Crime Does Not Pay. These were really gritty, violent comics based on actual events from the news of the day. There was a fascination in criminals and crime. Dick Tracy had sort of captured some of that, but this was grittier. This was far more real, far more violent, and unapologetic about the amoral and abject depravity of the criminals. One of the problems that true crime had was there were no recurring characters, and each story began with a whole new set of actors. They solved this problem by introducing a character who becomes their omniscient narrator, an interlocutor. As Mr. Crime, he would be in the background, describing the events impassively, or sometimes entering the narrative to goad on the villains in a way that then celebrate their downfall and their eventual destruction. True crime was quite a violent genre, dealing with drugs and addiction and the depravity of that. It became very worrying that the true crime comics were now sitting next to comics that were decidedly for children in drugstores where you would buy your comic books on the comic book stand. These kinds of comics were seen right next to each other. There was no attempt to sort them out. Comics were comics, and parents and other leaders began to take notice of this worrying trend. Another growth in a new genre at this time began with these romance comics. A lot of them dealt with soldiers returning from war, estranged from their relations, and slowly working themselves back into some kind of normalcy. Romance comics always featured at some point a prominent kiss, where the lovers would eventually reconcile or find true love. Romance comics were definitely geared toward an older audience, and they really found a very powerful and positive reception there. Jack Kirby, who was our creator of Captain America, moved into this genre and was very successful in the late 1940s with young romance. Archer St. John was probably the most advanced and sophisticated romance comic publisher, and they took on all kinds of subjects. They actually hired live models, and they worked from the latest fashions. They knew that to really engage an adult audience, they needed to have very realistic, very believable situations, and they wanted to have a real, an emotional connection to what was happening. Unfortunately, romance comics would come up against a major, powerful shift that was happening, and even Archer St. John, with their highly artistic product, couldn't survive the decade. In his fraternity pin, they took a really extraordinary story about a North Korean and South Korean couple and how the war in Korea at the time was tearing them apart, and their own anger and frustration at Americans and their misunderstanding of their own culture. Classics Illustrated emerged at this time in a hope to try and create a little more literary heft to the comic industry. Gilberton Publications would hire talented artists and writers to create illustrated classics. These proved fairly popular, and because they were classics, they were one of the first to reprint them. So they could continue to reap benefits from them. Classics never grow old. And so, unlike other publishers who would work to create a story that might flop, they could learn to exploit the popular stories and expand on those themes and ideas. Of course, the classics illustrated that were most popular were adventure stories, pirate stories, and the such. Trying to elevate comics, Max Gaines took his share in DC Comics as editor of the very popular Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and he sold it to create his own comic. He was getting tired of the crass commercialism, and he wanted to create some genuine, uplifting, religious stories. And he created Educational Comics, or EC Comics. This was a really struggling venture. It never really found an audience, and the church, which had criticized comics for their base and vulgar depictions of everything, really couldn't be convinced that picture stories from the Bible was any better. And this hurt Max Gaines because, as a devout Catholic, he really hoped that his comics would entice a new audience to his work. Unfortunately, Max Gaines died suddenly in a boating accident in 1947, and his son, William Gaines, found himself at the helm of this comic book publisher that was failing. After trying for a while to keep his dad's business afloat, he sat down with his chief editor, Al Feldstein, and commiserated over the fate of the magazine. And he said, "What if we just made comics that we wanted to make? What if we stopped trying to be all high and mighty and educational? Maybe we should just be entertaining." And so he changed the title of the company from Educational Comics to Entertaining Comics and began to publish a number of really outrageous and exciting and vivid stories, really focusing on the horror theme, which had been growing in popularity. EC's circulation of horror and suspense comics were in the 300,000 to 450,000 per issue range. That is just staggering. By today's standards, that's 10 times what most comics publish at. With this huge success, he was able to spin out new titles and create a whole host of very excited, energetic artists working for him. Harvey Kurtzman, Graham Ingalls, Joe Orlando. And what I want you to notice from this page is just how very different the art styles were. The common practice at this time was for a publisher of comics to institute a house style, and that all the artists were forced to conform their drawing style to what would be the brand of the house. EC Comics took a different tack. He wanted artists to work in ways in which they found most expressive. And he allowed for this variance to create a really compelling and strange combination of stories in horror, war comics, and science fiction, which is a personal favorite of William Gaines. Science fiction was not a big seller, but he found it a personal favorite, and he adapted the stories of the up-and-coming writer Ray Bradbury, who he adapted a number of the stories and eventually arranged for collaboration with him. A lot of these stories in science fiction especially dealt with moral issues. Joe Orlando's very famous Judgment Day, where in the far future, Earth has become such a powerful place of class and race unity that they are now visiting other planets and helping them overcome their racial differences. And this is powerfully revealed in the last panel where a black man takes off his space helmet for the first time, and we see the stars glistening in the sweat on his face. These were called preachies, a name they gave to their titles which had moral themes. One of the other artists who worked for EC Comics really took the art of comic making very seriously and wanted to develop ways in which comics communicated. So the sense of drama and that he was able to create in his work was really astounding. One of the several ways that he approached this was he was very limited in the number of pages that he had to work with. Most stories that he drew on were at most 6 or 8 pages, sometimes only 4 pages. And so he had to really compress the action to show a series of drawings on a panel where the figure is moving through a number of different emotions, creating and heightening the sense of drama. He also used the sort of psychological effects of dreams and sort of heightened ways of representing this through color and exploding lights, the dizziness of waking up after a disturbing dream. He also dealt with the sort of dark confusion in this of a policeman chasing and imagining the murderer. And here we see him, the violent imagination of the policeman as he's pursuing the criminal. And the way he breaks those pictures up, focusing on the knife and allowing the figure to create abstract shapes. Perhaps his most powerful work is Master Race from 1955. This was just after World War II, and people really hadn't been talking about the Jewish Holocaust. It had been on the news sporadically, but reports were confused, and the scale of what took place was really unimaginable. And so Master Race was one of the early attempts to really address that violence and the horror that it created for its survivors and the need for vengeance.